Joining us is Fouad Ajami. He's the director of the Middle East Studies program at Johns Hopkins University, a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution. Dr. Ajami, thanks so much for joining us. Let me ask you first. You are a supporter of the war in Iraq. You've called it a noble endeavor because we went in there, took out a tyrannical dictator, and tried to spread sort of the ideals of freedom and democracy. Do you think then that it would be hypocritical of the U.S. not to call for Mubarak to step down, not to call for new elections there?
Well, we're on the horns of a dilemma with Hosni Mubarak. Remember, Hosni Mubarak is a cunning and sly man. He's been able to play American presidents, 5 of them, since 1981. He's been able to take our coin and run amok of our purposes. And we're on the horns of this dilemma with him because he presents himself to us as a guardian of our interests, as a man who keeps the terrorists at bay, as a man who keeps the peace process with Israel on track. So the time has come now to acknowledge that maybe Hosni Mubarak may have given his country a dozen good years, but he's given it 18 terrible years. And he, in fact, has triggered some of this terror that we have faced in our own country. An argument could be made that some of the terror that hit America on 9/11 was a gift of Hosni Mubarak to us. He repressed his own people. They displaced their anger onto us, and we face what we face.
Do you think that we're seeing now a darker side of Egypt than maybe we thought? You know, we've all thought of Egypt as a strong ally, and there hasn't been much news of the oppression there, of the police state, the military state under which they live. How bad is it?
Well, Matt, look, there is 1.7 million people in Egypt who work for the Ministry of Interior. And the Ministry of Interior in Egypt, as in other third world countries, has nothing to do with forests and eagles. It has to do with prisons and oppression. So Hosni Mubarak has put together a very repressive state. And I think what's clear now is that the house of Mubarak has fallen. Regardless of what happens next, if the military intervenes, the house of Mubarak, that means Mr. Mubarak, Suzanne Mubarak, his wife, who must have been the second most powerful person in the country, Jamal Mubarak, his son who was bidding to be his successor, and Ala Mubarak, his son who has the run of the marketplace and the business rackets in the country. The house of Mubarak has completely collapsed, and millions of Egyptians at home and abroad are telling Mubarak in every way they can to get the hell out of Egypt.
We don't want to make a secret of the fact that you are also a friend of George Bush, a friend of the administration there. You have said that the seed of democracy was a child of the Bush doctrine.
Yes.
Do you think that's what we're really seeing come to bear here, or is it an economic story of high unemployment, high poverty, food inflation?
You know, that's a good question. I think it's really about the story of Egyptian dignity and the story about what I call the Tunisia envy that sees Egypt. Look at the Egyptians. They have an idea of themselves as being the dominant Arab people, 80 million people. And they look at Tunisia, a marginal country in North Africa, on the outer margin of Arab consciousness. It rebels. It expels its despots. And there is Zain al-Abidin bin Ali. He flees his country with his wife, the hairdresser, who takes with her 1.5 tons of gold. And the Egyptians look at their country and they say, what's become of us? And I think that really was the origins of this protest. It was completely contingent in many ways. The tinder was there, the material was there, the spark was supplied by Tunisia.
Dr. Ajami, what becomes of Egypt? Is it going to be better going forward, in your view, in terms of some of the options that we're hearing kicked about in the press?
Well, you know, Carol, I don't know. I mean, there is an expression I like. The Muslims use it a lot. Allahu A'lam. Only Allah knows exactly what will happen to and for the Egyptians. What's clear to us is that millions of Egyptians have gone out into the street with a chant of one word, irhal, which means get lost, be gone, to Mubarak. So they wish to be rid of Pharaoh. They wish to be rid of his wife. They wish to be rid of his children and his retainers and these caterpillars of the realm who eat everything.
But be careful what you wish for, because that's why I'm curious, because
Yes.
we talk about the Muslim Brotherhood and some of the other folks that have been talked about as possible successors or to help with the transition. Sure. Do we need to be worried about that?
Is that a radical group?
Look, there are radical groups in Egypt, but there are also good people.
What about the Muslim Brotherhood? Is that a radical group in your
Absolutely.
estimation?
And I think there will be a contest over the life of Egypt. If I were to make a gamble, and I like the expression, it's hard to predict, particularly the future. If I were to try to predict the course for Egypt, the most powerful institution is going to be the army. I'd love to be a fly on the wall when the senior officers of the army, the dominant institution in the country, the institution from which Mubarak himself came. He had just been an Air Force officer when Sadat picked him to be his vice president. Those officers are going to have a conversation with Pharaoh about his ways and about what remains of his term, which is, some months, September, October, and about the options for him and for the country. That will be the dominant decision in the country.
What's the risk for the United States in terms of this? This has been a very crucial ally and a crucial relationship.
Absolutely. Look, we have enormous money invested in Egypt, about $1.5 billion every year. We have tremendous interest in Egypt. And the Egyptian people, rightly or wrongly, see us as accomplices in the Egyptian regime. They see Mubarak as our man on the banks of the Nile.
That's not good.
No, it's not good. Our honor and our reputation is implicated in what Mubarak does. And millions of Egyptians are looking to us to say morally and strategically what we think of the ways of Hosni Mubarak.
Has President Obama stumbled, in your view, in the Obama administration, not coming out and saying Mubarak needs to go?
I think it's hard because you don't want to go out and say, be gone. Let it be for the Egyptians to make this. But there has been enormous strategic confusion in the Obama administration. I'll give you an example. Secretary of State Clinton, with the top information available to her a few days ago, said Egypt is a stable regime. Now, there is, of course, Vice President Biden, famous for some of his wonderful expressions, the Bidenism, I call them. The Bidenism, the other day, Vice President Biden said, Hosni Mubarak is not a dictator. When every child in Egypt carrying a banner in the streets of Cairo and Alexandria and Suez knows that this man is a dictator. And maybe Mubarak himself may say he's a dictator, leaving our administration looking quite amateurish in this field.
Do we face in that case, last week people were saying this could be the Berlin Wall moment for the Arab world, and I was thinking a great time for President Obama to say, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. But of course he didn't say that. Do we then face more of a sort of Shah to Ayatollah kind of situation here?
Well, I think that's a very, very good remark, whether this would be the Berlin Wall for the Arabs. This could end with heartbreak for the Arabs. The Arabs have been there before. They've been in this situation before. A lot of thunder and the rain doesn't come. Because you've seen these protests everywhere, in Yemen, in Tunisia, in Egypt, in Algeria, even in the monarchies like Jordan. And I think now the question for the region as a whole, is there a good alternative to the autocrats? Because the autocrats are old, and the autocrats are stuck in their ways. The region is young. And the young people of the region, in Egypt and elsewhere, they want a new future, but these autocrats know no reform. They can't reform because that's the world they know and they inhabit.
All right, Dr. Ajami, thank you so much for spending some time with us today. Fouad Ajami from Johns Hopkins and the Hoover Institute.